I'm Rakesh. I'm currently serving as the Dean of Harvard College. Just a little bit, so I was born in India, grew up here in New York City, in Queens. I started off my academic career at SUNY Binghamton, transferred to Cornell, worked for a couple of years, and then came back here for graduate school. And it's been really, being part of higher education has been a wonderful experience for me. But I want to talk a little bit about, I think, the sort of aspects and I think all the opportunities that higher education presents, but also some of the challenges. And I will share with you some of the conversations and work I've been doing with undergraduates who are here at Harvard. And so I'm not going to try to present it as sort of careful social science, but I'm going to sort of share with you their thoughts and points of view and try to put some framing around it. So, May is a great month for higher ed. It's perhaps the most important symbolic month. So I know, especially for David and Kathy to be here, because it's our kind of version of our kind of circle of beginnings and endings, right? So the high school students who are coming in, who've been filling, applications out and recommendations all last year, were making their decisions to come toward the, at the beginning of this month. And we are also, sending our students out in terms of commencement as well. And, I think we all know the script by heart. In a few months, we'll, as we welcome the new students who will be deciding what they want to study, what courses they want to take, and who they want to live with and be around while they're in college. We're also sending out our students who have been shaped by their experience here at colleges and institutions, and will shape their role as citizens and citizen leaders and the positions they'll take after they leave institutions like ours. And this process itself is kind of anchored in the history of our nation and its founding. I think it's anchored, we can go back to the Northwest Ordinance, but we can also go back before that to even the founding of institutions like Harvard, as the importance of education, importance of the founding beliefs, importance of engaged democracy, and notions of that somehow a nation like ours was going to move away from the notion of inherited privilege to this notion of meritocracy. And our nation has invested countless hours and countless dollars into higher education with these ideas in mind. And I think the idea that a good public school education combined with a college degree was really seen for many of us as the example par excellence of meritocracy. And it can't be taken for granted any longer. I found this Economist article a couple of years ago. I remember seeing it, and I was looking for the cover. It had this notion of what it's described as America's new aristocracy. And it was part of a critique of selective institutions, mostly motivated, if you got a chance to read the article, about the growing inequality gap in the US. And it was also, I think, in some ways very misguided, because the institutions it was focused on are really a very small microcosm of the landscape of higher education in the United States. And while there's an oversized focus on selective colleges in our collective conscience, these colleges are the exception, not the rule. If you look at around the 4,000, depending on how you count, institutions of higher education in the United States, colleges and universities, only 46 of them have admissions rates less than 20%. And in fact, out of the 17 million students in college today, less than 300,000 will be in a residential liberal arts and sciences experience, probably like some of us or many of us might have been in our own college or have family or friends, children in. And moreover, out of the 70% of the students who are in American high school graduates who enroll in college, only 40% or so, 40% of that group will attend community colleges. A significant majority are actually over 25, and most will not finish within 5 years. And so I think it's really easy to kind of focus on our kind of little tiny tip of the glacier of higher education institutions, and yet there is an enormous amount of focus on them. Elite schools continue to shape so much of our cultural understanding of college, and there's some good parts to it, but a double-edged part that I'm going to talk about, and I think the students' experience as well. So even going back, for example, this focus all the time on these elite schools, and I'm quoting Ernest, what a great name, who wrote in his book Academic Procession at the beginning of the 20th century, quote, "To an amazing degree, the pattern set by Harvard, Yale, and Princeton after 1880 became that of colleges all over the country. The clubs, the social organizations, the athletes, even the clothes and the slang of the big three were copied by college youth throughout the nation. Another faculty member at Yale, Canby, wrote in 1905, he described Yale in the following way: money counted, social standing outside counted, good looks counted, also more, and so did good clothes in the collegiate manner, which required the slovenly use of expensive and well-cut garments. By the 1890s, then Harvard, Yale, and Princeton had really become iconic institutions exerting a broad influence on the national culture and our definition of what it meant to be a college student. Athletics was another area. Again, the first athletic match was a rowing match between Harvard and Yale. And we all know, I think, the impact that's had on higher education and the role that it plays in the cultural authority and understanding of higher education. What's interesting about this work is that, more recently, going back to the Economist article, is this critique about, the role of inequality in college, and then increasingly a discussion of students as colleges have tried to, expand through financial aid and other efforts, bringing historically underrepresented groups into colleges and universities. But what's interesting about that is that that critique, which seems so recent, is a really old critique. Schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, other selective schools have had financial aid almost since their founding. And there's always been this notion that there's actually two types of schools going on at the same time in institutions like this. And part of that is that these works, and we can look back at the more classic works to the more contemporary ones, is that the idea is that college is not only a source of social mobility, which I think a lot of people often focus on, but also can reinforce class inequalities. And that idea, just to say, is not new. There's almost 75 years of academic literature that highlights that many university structures are literally designed for students privileged enough to glide their way through school, knowing full well that they will have a job, social resources, social capital, and a high status position in society waiting for them on the other end. C. Wright Mills, sociologist, wrote in his famous book, The Power Elite, which was written in the 1950s, and I'll quote, "In the upper classes, it does not by itself mean much merely to have a degree from an Ivy League school. That's assumed. The point is not Harvard, but which Harvard? By Harvard, one means Porcellian, Fly, or AD. These are final clubs, all male clubs. By Yale, one means Zeta Psi, or Fence, or Delta Kappa Epsilon." Jerome Karabel, in his book, The Chosen, said there's always been financial aid at schools like Harvard and Yale alongside other selective schools. But even in 1908, Harvard had about 45% of its students from public schools. Over 20% of the students were from historically what we would, they were all male, obviously, but about 20% were identified as Jewish, 40% identified as Jewish at Columbia, and also geographically from middle class and also lower middle class families. And so I think this notion that there's always been two tracks inside elite institutions is really important. And Nancy Malkiel also finds the same thing in discussing coeducation battles at schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth. And Anthony Jack most recently finds, again, he talks about the two institutions that exist in the book, in Privileged Poor. And I think what these books find is, I think, again, there's lots of books, 3 or 4 common threads that you would see through them, which is, one is that there is one track which provides a way for affluent, mostly white, socially oriented students to isolate themselves from their less privileged peers. There's a second track, the second aspect, which is historically marginalized students face greater challenges, including achievement compared to their affluent counterparts. And third, the dominant culture of college rewards not just the academically prepared, but the socially prepared for taking full advantage of the opportunity structures that could be offered by colleges. And the question, I think, going back to the theme of this conference is, if we've known about this for so long, and Harvard's about to have its 400th anniversary in 2036, why does it persist? Right? Things persist because there's interest in them persisting. And I want to sort of just put out some hypotheses about why it persists. So the first explanation that things persist is one that organizational sociology, the field that I'm most closely associated with, talks about as organizational imprinting. And the idea there is that organizations are of necessity created out of the specific context. It could be technical, economic, cultural resources at their founding. And that context organizations are shaped by historical specific resources upon which their founders draw. And that once founded, these organizations survive far into the future with those founding structures largely intact because the latter continue to be efficient, or because of inertial forces such as tradition, vested interest, or ideology, or because of lack of competition. And so here, when you think about places like Harvard, which is on the left of that picture, when it was first founded, Harvard based its admissions on very subjective judgments of students' character and family background, and their demonstrated proficiency in Latin and Greek. At their first commencement, for example, which continued, this practice continued till well into the 1730s. So at their 1642 first commencement, there was lavish feast, which we would recognize. There was lots of celebration, which we would recognize. There was also tests given, which we would not recognize. But what was interesting is that when the students were commenced, they were not ordered in alphabetical ways. Rather, the first graduate, the ordering of how degrees were announced was not age or scholarship, I quote, or the alphabet, but according to the rank of their families held in society. And so they would go and they would rank the status of each of the families, and this practice continued well into the 1700s here. The academics continued to sort of be part of the discussion. They added more languages, they added math, et cetera. But in many ways, this notion that social status mattered was really at their founding and persisted not just at that first commencement, but continued. The other photo is the Yale football team in the early 20th century. If you look at the demographics there, what you see again, and this notion of imprinting is really important. So even last week when Harvard released its Legacy of Slavery report, you actually saw the same idea there. Quote, notwithstanding Harvard's rhetorical commitment, and this was in the war's wake to reference the Civil War, to recruit a nationally representative student body that would make model political collegiality, the university's sights remained set on a white upper crust. Harvard prized the admission of academically able Anglo-Saxon students from elite backgrounds, including wealthy white sons of the South, and it restricted the enrollment of so-called outsiders. So for the rest of the argument that I want to sort of just present a little bit here, it's not just the imprinting, but what does that imprinting do to our students despite interventions as they go through the experience? And I don't want to say that there's not good interventions. There have been really significant ones. But the persistence of this kind of dual track is the part that I want to sort of talk about a little bit. Because even after an extensive financial aid program, Harvard College has almost as many students from the nation's top 0.1%. So it's 0.1%. Highest income families as from the bottom 20%. And more than half of the students come from the top 10% of the income distribution. And the vast majority, more than 2/3, come from the top 20%. This is Raj Chetty and Friedman's work. And at top colleges overall, the proportion of students from the richest 1%, so this is sort of defined as the Ivy plus, of families has increased during the last decade, while the proportion from the bottom 40% has decreased. Sometimes it can look like we're admitting more students, but the part of it is that the definitions have changed. So the Pell Grant definition got much higher. So it looks like we admit more Pell Grant students. And this is very understandable, but getting into selective institutions is very hard. And really being poor and all the sort of challenges that implies makes it very hard to get a good education. And our K-12 education is very uneven. And so let me just set the context here. I met with a group of Harvard students. Most already knew each other, and I asked them how social class impacted their Harvard experience. And there were a diverse group of students, 3 self-identified as people of color, 4 identified as male, 2 identified as female. 1 was a first-year student, 2 of them had taken time off during the pandemic. And they described their experience, and they all uniformly were glad to be at Harvard. Several said the pandemic had really given them time to reflect on their college experience, what they valued, how they realized they were changing, and where they were finding themselves. What was really interesting is the high level of awareness of their outsiderness. Again, something that Jerome Carabel, C. Wright Mills, and others had pointed to. The first thing is they pointed to just the role of the context. And I love this Laurel Ulrich quote. The context itself just sets a tone about who belongs and who doesn't. It is the ambient environment of entering our dorms, looking at who's on the walls, the library, and the institution chooses selectively to sort of highlight that history. This was something, again, critiqued in the History of Slavery report. What was interesting to me is that it was also critiqued in Laurel Ulrich's report around gender, and that was 25 years earlier, and it could have been like word for word the same arguments. So as students say, class is always there, but not always visible. It's only when the zones overlap. You sometimes notice it when you're hanging out, but it becomes especially evident during COVID. People fled to the islands and summer homes. Others were still gymming. These are all terms I love learning from the students, which means they had gyms in their houses, and you followed your peers on Instagram stories and could literally peer into the other side. People who are FGLI have a hard time navigating upper class culture, especially when you first get here. The upper class people know how to have more conversations. There are more conversations about where they've gone and what they do. You're reminded about that the place was not originally designed for you. You eventually learn to speak a different language, but feel like an imposter. So students actually talk about, I think, this notion of high levels of awareness, but also the performativity aspects of what they're doing. So that's one way that the inequality persists. The second way is on social comparison. I won't read these quotes out loud, but you can see that reference groups start changing for our students. They begin to see the life that's possible before them, and they see their own attitudes and values shift, and they're very conscious of that. I think the idea that somehow we're doing something. Students understand they're living in these spaces. And it becomes naturalized. By the way, the new term I learned was PJing, which I thought had something to do with pajamas, but it turns out private jetting, that students become aware of this, and it naturalizes for them. Lots of people are swayed. It's not unconscious. Knowing where I came from, this is the fastest way to get ahead, and it's a double-edged sword. And a lot of this also mostly happens outside of the classroom. And that's the thing I think is really quite important. And that's exactly the same story that C. Wright Mills said. It's exactly the same story that Nancy Malkia points out. It mostly plays out outside of the classroom. It shows up in leisure and job searches. What are you doing when you're not studying? Career fairs. Which job occupations are you prepared for? Which jobs are you aware of? And then, in its own strange way, works out in the sort of inequalities where delayed decisions around graduate school because you want to take your MCATs again, but you don't have the resources, so you have to work your job again, and you start that cycle over again. So I think this is something that you have to become quite aware of. Gender is also something that students are quite aware, but it was much more complicated and nuanced than I had expected, that it intersects with a lot of other issues, including class issues, including status issues, and the interplay is really what happens really critically. One of the students had read the work Paying for the Party, and she talked a lot about the polished femininity that was expected of women or those who identify as women. It really talked about how it doesn't really make space for other non-conforming or other diverse identities. But I think one of the things I would say is that, again, the students are quite aware of what's happening. It's not unconscious. I think there's a lot of critical thinking. So I want to just leave you with some tentative assertions. There's always been inequality in higher education. Who's poor has to be understood in relative terms, not absolute terms. For most of its history, elite and non-elite coexist in the same institution. Extracurricular life and symbols are the primary markers of class in the undergraduate experience, and taking advantage of the opportunity of elite education is particularly manifest in changing attitudes, values, and career choices. Now that's why it persists. Last point, sometimes things change, but it's really hard. If we look at the social movements in higher education, there has been progress, there has been movement. And I'm going to leave you with the final hypotheses. I have no idea whether these are true or not. But when I look back at social movements that moved institutions, which are, by definition are systems designed not to change, here's what I found. National and global issues reframed as campus issues are positively associated with institutional change. You could look at apartheid, you could look at civil rights, you could look at some other movements, environmental movements. Student protests with faculty allies are more likely to produce some change than those that are just student-driven. Campus movements led by privileged students and alumni are positively associated with institutional change, the most probably prevalent one being the anti-Vietnam War protests. The fear of reactionary movements led by privileged students and alumni inhibit institutional change, and I can talk about that during the panel if anybody who ever wants is interested in that. And then finally, campus movements anchored in resource student organizations as opposed to petitions, unorganized social movements, referendums, and social media are positively associated with institutional change. And I think too often, people trying to make change try too often with the social media and the petitions, rather than the sort of organizational, sustained ally building alumni and faculty, creating those groups together and creating allyship between those groups. So thank you so much for this time.